This video concerns the life and political thinking of key thinker number 4 for nationalism, Charles Maurras, who was born in 1868 and died in 1952. He was a French author, poet and politician and founder of the Action Française movement. He is an integral nationalist. You might also see this written as chauvinistic nationalist. For an integral nationalist, the needs of the nation will always be taking precedence over the needs of an individual, but also chauvinistic nationalists will believe in the inherent superiority of some nations and groups of people over others. Charles Maurras was a backward-looking nationalist. He wanted to go back to the glory days of France, which he believed to be the time of Louis XV. So he was a pro-monarchist, anti-democracy, anti-parliamentarian and counter-revolutionary individual. He was anti-communist, anti-Protestant and anti-Semitic. A key quote from Maurras and his view of nationalism is, "A true nationalist places his country above everything." And you'll see from his lifespan that Maurras lived through both the First and Second World Wars, which were tumultuous times for the French people. He was incredibly anti-German, and that very much influenced his views of the First and Second World War. He believed that the Treaty of Versailles was not harsh enough. He was on the right wing of French politics, arguing that Germany should have been punished further. In the Second World War, he supported the Vichy regime, which was propped up by the Nazi government in Germany. And the reason for his support of the Vichy regime is the so-called Free France, the government that was in exile. He believed was under the influence of the British, but more worryingly for Maurras, he believed Free France was under the influence of the Soviet Union. And despite his open and well-known anti-Semitism, he opposed his own government's deportation of Jews to the Nazi concentration camps. And I feel that this is where his anti-German sentiment and his anti-Semitism collided. He visited Greece in 1896, and that's when he first offers a criticism of democracy. He believes that democracy and its ability to allow many different political opinions leads to internal divisions, and for that reason, democracy was doomed. But he was also concerned about Greece's openness towards foreigners. And Maurras is going to have a very exclusive concept and idea of what it means to be French. So, at the turn of the 20th century in France, we get the Dreyfus Affair, which is a situation where a member of the French Armed Forces, Alfred Dreyfus, who is of Jewish descent, is wrongly accused of spying for the German government. And despite evidence to the contrary, despite that the trial and justice was misapplied, Maurras supported the arrest and punishment of Alfred Dreyfus and opposed the second trial, which eventually exonerated him. He formed the Action Française movement in 1899, which was an anti-revolutionary, anti-Protestant, anti-democracy, anti-foreigner, anti-Semitic movement. It had a very exclusive idea of what it meant to be French, and it supported the restoration of the French monarchy. Many of its members turned towards fascism in the 1930s. Maurras himself supported the fascists Franco in Spain and Mussolini in Italy, but his anti-German sentiment meant that he always opposed Hitler and the Nazi regime in Germany. And that does also mean that when the Second World War begins, his views of Mussolini begin to sour because Mussolini is fighting on the side of Hitler and the Nazis. When France was liberated, he was arrested in September 1944, and he was charged with crimes against the French people. He was eventually convicted of incitement to murder and given a life sentence. He becomes very ill in the early 1950s. He's given a pardon from his prison sentence, and he eventually dies in hospital. And he is an inspiration of the far right, both in France and beyond, for most of the 20th century. So, what does Charles Maurras have to say about human nature? For Maurras, you cannot separate nationality and ethnicity. Your ethnicity determines your nationality, and your nationality and your national heritage defines your character. So Maurras had a very particular view of what it meant to be French. And although he himself, he was born a Catholic, as he sort of enters adulthood, he becomes doubtful of his faith. Before he dies, he converts and receives the last rites, as many agnostics have done on their deathbed. For Maurras, a Jew could not be a true Frenchman. So for his nationalism, what it meant to be French, if you were Protestant or Jewish or what he referred to as a foreigner or a Freemason, if you were one of those four groups, Jews, Protestants, Freemasons and foreigners, you couldn't truly be French. And I suppose that links now to society, his very particular view of society. And he wanted an ordered society, and he believed that those groups sowed division within society. So, just to recap, human nature, our ethnicity determines our nationality, and our national heritage, our nationality and our ethnicity combined define our character. With society, again, it's dominated by a person's ethnicity, and for him, some societies were superior to others. Some groups of people were more civilized, more forward-thinking, more progressed than others. We'll move on now to the state. When it comes to the state, he doesn't buy into these universal ideas. So he rejects the concept that democracy will be good in France, will be good in Britain, will be good in Germany. For him, each country's arrangements need to be bespoke. Some nation states are greater than others, and some have a better or more refined systems of government. And for Maurras, the greatest state that France had ever enjoyed was the monarchy of Louis XV. And so he wanted to go back to that time. He wanted a strong government, one that rejected democracy. And one thing that one quote I've come across when researching Maurras is, the great evil comes not from communism or socialism, but from democracy. Democracy upsets, menaces, torments, and paralyses. So the state must be strong. The state must not be a democracy, and must go back to the greatness of the monarchy of Louis XV. And finally, the economy. Remember that for Charles Maurras, certain groups of people are superior to others. And those superior social groups will form superior nations who will dominate economically also. So that superiority of certain groups of people will lead to economic dominance on account of their natural superiority to other groups. Okay, so to summarise for Charles Maurras, what type of nationalist is he? BL, backward looking. He's looking back at what once made France a greater nation than the one that he lived in, and he wanted to restore those qualities and that pride. And then for I, it stands for two things: integral, but also inward looking. For Maurras, the nation's needs always went ahead of the needs of the individual. That's the integral bit. The inward looking bit is that Maurras looks at French society and picks and chooses groups that he believes to be a true part of French society. Remember, he excluded those four groups: Freemasons, Protestants, Jews and foreigners. Those four groups could not know what it meant to be French and to submit themselves to the nation. I've put C for chauvinistic. The idea that certain groups of people and therefore certain nations are superior to others. And that's where his anti-Semitism comes from, but it's also where his anti-German sentiment comes from as well. His resentment for Germany and the German nation and the German people stems back from way prior to the First World War, probably the War of 1871. The consequences of which he will have become aware of as he was growing up. The loss of Alsace-Lorraine, that loss of territory on the border with Germany to the young German state, hurt the pride of the French nation. And so that chauvinism, that idea that certain groups of people and therefore certain nations are superior to others, very much defines Maurras's nationalism.